Welcome everyone to Not That Media. My name is John, and in today's video I want to talk to you about Psycho 2. No, not the 1983 original picture from Universal Studios, but a completely different story and timeline which was released a full year before the movie, which involved Norman Bates in a very different capacity. So for better or for worse, come along with me as I do a deep delve into Psycho 2, the novel, featuring Norman Bates and None on the Run. By the late 70s into the 80s, Hollywood was full steam ahead with its sequel train, and horror was no exception to this. To name a few, we had Exorcist II: The Heretic, released in 1977, Dawn of the Dead in 1978, Jaws Part 2 also in 1978, Friday the 13th Part 2 in 1981, and Halloween 2 in 1981. Established IPs were Hollywood's ticket to quick box office success, so all movies were up for the sequel treatment. And with Norman Bates not only profitable but alive and well at the end of the story, why not bring him back as well? At the same time as the sequel boom was occurring, Robert Bloch actually wrote a manuscript for Psycho 2 and presented it to Universal Studios as an option for a sequel. The movie idea was categorically hated by all involved at Universal Studios. The commentary and social satire towards the splatter genre, the creative process of movie making, and numerous digs towards the studio was just too much, so they passed on the option and Robert Bloch was out the door. Ironically, as part of selling the original movie script to Universal Studios, Robert Bloch had also sold the sequel rights, so they were under no obligation to utilise any of the material that Robert Bloch had presented to them. So a very bitter Bloch was left out in the cold, and Universal Studios proceeded to get moving with Psycho 2, the movie. Robert Bloch published his novel in 1982, and it has to be said it did receive praise and it did sell well. Now, whether or not you believe that is down to the subject matter of the book is your opinion. I happen to think that because there was stirrings in Hollywood at the time of a Psycho sequel, coupled with the cachet of the name Psycho, I believe that the success of this novel was largely down to the name as opposed to the actual story. But I can't prove that, and that's just my opinion. The reviews for this book were actually very mixed. Some did praise the satire and the commentary, which I've already mentioned, and other people damned it as being crude and just basically splatter nonsense. Now, that was just a little bit on Robert Bloch and the genesis of the novel. I didn't want to do a full biography or anything like that, but I do think it's important to make you aware of the events that led to the creation of this novel, purely because I think the proposition of the manuscript, the rejection, and the feelings as a result of that are present within this novel. Now, one of the questions that I asked myself very early on, and perhaps you wish to as well, is should you consider this novel a sequel to the original novel of Psycho or the sequel to the 1960 movie? There's no right or wrong, it's entirely your choice, but for the purposes of this video, I am presenting this as a sequel to the 1960 movie. The reason being, ultimately, before this was a novel, this was a written manuscript that Robert Bloch proposed to be the original sequel to Psycho. So under that guise, he would have been writing it, or should have been writing it, from the perspective of the events we see in Psycho 1, the movie. Now, before I jump into the book, I do want to spend a moment just talking about what I love about Psycho 2. Now, unlike its contemporaries, Hellraiser, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc., etc., the Psycho sequels, for some reason, just don't seem to have the same level of notoriety or love that those ones do. People know that there are 10, 12, 13 Halloweens, 8 Friday the 13th, all this kind of stuff, but people don't even know or realise there is a Psycho 2. The number of times I've sat in conventions or I've been in queues, and at one point I was even affiliated with a cult classic horror podcast who I was in regular dialogue with, all of them would say the same thing. Wait a minute, there's a Psycho 2? So I find it odd that such a worthy sequel to such a legendary film goes so unnoticed. I'm going to make an assumption here that if you are watching this video, you have already seen Psycho 2 the movie. But if you haven't, here is a spoiler-free review, but I do recommend you go and see this film if you can get it. Psycho 2 the movie picks up 22 years after the events of Psycho 1. Having been incarcerated the whole time, Norman Bates is now declared legally sane by the state and is released into the care of his psychiatrist played by Robert Loggia. This is much to the anger of some of the townspeople who demand the memory of what he did before be recognised, and that when he kills again, the blood will be on all of their hands. Norman, obviously naturally upset by this, is driven home by his doctor to the Bates Motel, and obviously for the first time in 22 years sees his home upon the hill. When they arrive, the motel is being operated by a gentleman by the name of Mr. Toomey, and it becomes clear that Norman will not be working at the motel. Although obviously it's still his, there is a state-appointed manager looking after it. Instead, the state get him a job at the local burger joint where he becomes friends with the local manager, the kindly Mrs. Spool, and Mary, played by Jennifer Tilly's sister, Meg Tilly, who is a down-in-her-luck girl who has just been dumped by her boyfriend. Norman, having witnessed this and trying to do a kind thing, offers for her to stay up in the motel free of charge, and she agrees. However, when they get there, it becomes very clear that the motel is being used for ill repute as opposed to a credible motel. So, having asked Mary to go up to the property, up to the house, Norman confronts Mr. Toomey and eventually fires him. But because of the state of the motel, he asks Mary to stay in the property, as in the house. Mary is reluctant to do so, having heard whispers and gossip at the diner about what Norman did. Norman is quite open and frank with what he did, although he does miss out a couple of little details, aka everything that happened in Psycho 1, but he does openly admit that he was incarcerated for killing. Eventually, it is agreed that Mary will stay in the property because Norman is equally terrified to stay there as she is to stay with him. So the two form a mutual bond of fear and stay in the house. But that then obviously morphs into a friendship and they start to get on very well. Norman's doing very well with his job. But of course, it's a Psycho movie, so phone calls begin, shadowy figures begin to appear, notes start to appear, all in the guise of mother. Now, Norman, of course, is terrified of this, and this then means, obviously, that people will start to accuse him, calling him wacko and psycho, and this is you, isn't it? This is you. And Norman is being questioned. Has to question himself. Is he sane? Is he a good man? Is he doing his old tricks again? Or is there a more insidious plot going on around Norman to make him insane or to make him guilty and get him incarcerated again? Psycho 2, the movie, stands, in my humble opinion, as not only a great sequel to Psycho, but one of the best sequels to a movie in general. Anthony Perkins crafts a very relatable and sympathetic character, a prisoner in his own actions and who is constantly reminded that no matter how much you try to move on, the past is never really past and it stays with you all the time. The film makes no effort to replicate the original. It knows the shadow that it exists in and works really hard to give you a fresh take and be respectful at the same time to the original movie. There is a solid mystery. There are relatable characters. It's all questionable. Norman's allegiance, or your allegiance to Norman, is constantly questioned. I think that the Psycho movies realistically have the unique fact that Norman is a grey character. Is he good? Is he bad? Is he both? It's a question that the franchise will constantly ask, and Psycho 2 is one of the best, and it is on record as being Anthony Perkins' favourite Psycho sequel because it exonerated Norman. Norman was as much a victim as anybody else in the film. Can you be normal? Can you go home? Can you live in the past mistakes that you've made? Can you actually be sane if your psychiatrist is Robert Loggia? The film makes a point to question all of these things, and nothing feels redundant to the plot. The film builds to a really well-established climax that is there all the time. There's no bamboozling, there's no cheating. It's all there when you're paying attention. It is clean and it demands a second viewing the second you watch it, and watching that surprise. It has a twist at the end. I'm not going to spoil it. It has a couple of twists at the end, actually, it has to be said. But Psycho 2 is a really good film and I strongly recommend it. And I'm saying this before I start talking about this book. So now that we move on to the book review, my thoughts and notes on this novel have been written as a series of events. This is not going to be a blow-by-blow commentary. I am not going to be going through every single chapter. There are 37 chapters. Some are a couple of pages, some are many pages. This is designed to give you an overview and give reactions to and thoughts to the questions that I asked myself whilst I was reading it. So at this time, I do have to give you the obligatory spoiler warning. I am going to be going over this book, and whilst it is an overview, I will be going through the main details of this novel, so spoilers are ahead. I do not consider this to be a true book versus movie review, but it's impossible to not have those comparisons, and a lot of my feelings and frustrations are derived from the fact that if this was meant to be a sequel to the original movie, why did this happen? Why would you do this? Why would you do that? This is all my opinion. Okay, so this is not designed for commenters or people to come on and say, I'm totally wrong. If you think I'm wrong, that's fine. If you think this is a good book, I think you're wrong, is what I will tell you now. So this isn't for a big back and forth debate. This is just me presenting it to you as a lifelong Psycho movie fan. Psycho is up there in my top 5, easily in the top 3, I would probably say as well. I have a lot of love for this franchise, a lot of care for this franchise. So the following account of this novel comes from a position of love as much as a position of frustration. I was so frustrated by this book, it has to be said, that I actually ended up finishing it by listening to it on audio. So when people like to question like the level of dedication when it comes to making these, like, well, yeah, you just read the book. I bought this story, I was going to use a different word then, twice. So I bought the CD, which was a 8.5 hour epic, and even this was a slog towards the end. I started reading the book, I got about halfway through it, I just couldn't bring myself to just continue to read it, to dedicate the level of time to actually reading a book. And I'm hoping you'll quickly learn why I feel that way. But I just wanted to make it clear for the record, yeah, I bought this thing twice in making my decision because I wanted to get to the end of this book. I just couldn't get to the end of this book, so I had to listen to the last, I listened to it all again, it has to be said. I read half of it and then I listened to the whole thing again. So, dedication. I'm doing this so you don't have to. So the beginning, chapter 1 through 12. We join Norman Bates 22 years later. He is still incarcerated in a prison, not a sanitarium, but is now declared sane thanks to an experimental hypnotherapy by a Dr. Claiborne. As a result, Norman now lives a solitary life, virtually alone in the library every day. Dr. Claiborne, having brought Norman back to sanity, apparently shows very little to no interest in Norman now, so he's basically left to himself. It was revealed that Norman was stuck in a catatonic state at the end of the events of Psycho, that Norman was lost and the mother personality had taken over, but Dr. Claiborne, through this experimental procedures, had managed to pull Norman out of this catatonia, and as soon as this had happened, Mother was gone, and in effect, Norman is good. Now, it has to be said that neither Psycho 2 the book or Psycho 2 the film spends really any time explaining Norman's return to sanity. The film will make reference to the fact that Norman's memories have been taken away by the doctors, with the exception of the smell of toasted cheese sandwiches. He remembers that in a scene in Psycho 2. But the book obviously will explain hypnotherapy. I have no problem either way, the book or the film not going into full detail as to how Norman has been returned to sanity. I don't need, whilst it works in this film, I don't want Rob Zombie level Halloween psychiatrist scenes with a young Norman Bates and a doctor talking through things. I don't need to see Anthony Perkins or Norman Bates talking in Mother's voice. We've done it all. There is a really concise explanation at the end of Psycho 1 as to why Norman is the way he is. So to join Norman 22 years later, to be told he is sane, it's just a quick fix to get you where you need to be. So no objections there. Hypnotherapy, Again, I kind of prefer the ambiguity of the Psycho 2 movie just to explain that the doctors took his memories away, as opposed to, oh, they hypnotized him and made him better. But it's up to you. The book does state, though, that Norman, as part of his rehabilitation, did have a incident when he was in drag for a play in which he lost himself into the character and he saw a knife in his hand. Now, the problem with this in the book is it goes nowhere. There's no explanation. It just says, okay, he's sane. And then a second later it says, oh, but he did have a wobble. So they make a point to explain that. And you're kind of like, okay, not really sure what that's got to do with anything. You tell us that Norman's sane and mother is gone. And then the next minute you tell us that Norman's in drag and suddenly starts to be having flashbacks. It didn't quite gel. And that goes nowhere, it should be said. At this point, two nuns come to the hospital. One of them shows an interest in Norman. She's a relatively new nun, and she is taken to see him. At some point during a conversation with them, there is a power failure and the nurse is left alone with Norman. The prisoner's having this great idea to go off and investigate it. The prison guards are having a great idea to go off and investigate it. And like a cat that can be trusted, Norman is left alone with this nun. When the doctors return, it is revealed, of course, that the nun is dead, having been strangled with her rosemary beads and her clothes have been stolen. Now, from a book perspective, these two nuns get so much time in the novel, like chapters, their backstories, history of why they joined the church, their motivations to wanting to see Norman Bates in their cell. There's so much effort made to explain these nurses, but there's no effort made to explain Norman. You know, what is Norman doing? I understand what I said earlier about, you know, not having the whole idea of explaining how he was rehabilitated, but where is Norman 22 years later? It's never really explained what his headspace is. He is there, he is talking to the nun, there is a power cut, the nun's dead. Norman's return to madness, his heel turn, is not earned. It happens in moments on the page and totally undermines not only what we've just been told about his sanity, but it removes any possibility of empathy. There's no character development for Norman Bates now. And it just makes him unlikable, and it's almost like there's no characterization or remnants of Anthony Perkins in this iteration of Norman Bates. The movie spends so much time making Norman empathetic and spending time with Norman. Norman feels almost like a two-dimensional cardboard cutout at this point, a Hannibal Lecter, if you will, and rather than it being Clarice coming to visit him, it's a nun. And the second the power goes off, the completely healthy, completely happy, completely sane Norman Bates instantly goes crazy. So automatically I'm a little bit on the back foot thinking, well, is this really, you know, is this the true Norman Bates? Is something else going on here? But we'll continue with the novel. Again, if I jump around a little bit, then there will be a tiny bit of that. Meanwhile, Dr. Claiborne, Norman's doctor in the prison, is called to an office, not his office, one of his colleagues' office, because there is a producer from Hollywood on the phone asking for him. Dr. Claiborne asks him what he is calling about, and this producer asks if the script has been read yet. Dr. Claiborne saying, what script was he talking about? To which it is then revealed that Crazy Lady, a movie which is a fictionalized account of the events of Psycho 1, is in production, and that this other doctor had actually been acting as a creative advisor for the production team, providing insight into Norman and background and information. Dr. Claiborne is outraged by this. How dare this be going on? He is Norman is he is Norman's doctor, and he gets annoyed. At this point, the power goes out. There's also references given when he looks at the script, because Dr. Claiborne seeks out the script, that he was frustrated by the choice of actor for Norman Bates. He was also not happy that Norman was handsome, and there are notes to suggest that the Bates Motel has burnt to the ground. Now, To the book's credit, this is well over a decade and a half before Scream 2 started the meta plot idea of the stab movies. So I will give Robert Bloch a commendation for this, because he came up with this kind of concept years before Scream popularised it. But by the same merit, this is one of the first issues I have with the novel, is that Bloch will begin to hear, and constantly through this novel, take swings at the Psycho movie. Now, for those of you who don't know, Norman Bates, as depicted in the Psycho novel, is completely different to Anthony Perkins' portrayal in Psycho 1, the movie. Rather than a thin, handsome, boy-next-door style-looking gentleman that Anthony Perkins portrays, the portrayal of Norman Bates in the novel is much more questionable, and physically, he is actually more akin to, and this is said with absolute love, he is more akin to Paul Heyman, the WWE ECW personality, in terms of being a rotund, balding, older gentleman. He is an alcoholic. He looks tired. He looks run down. So when I say Paul Heyman, and I'm hoping the picture will flash up, the Norman Bates that is portrayed in the novel looks more like Paul Heyman when he was getting kicked out of the Bloodline recently, as opposed to Anthony Perkins. Now, I understand why they changed this for the movie, because let's be perfectly honest, if you were to sit down with the characterization of a rotund, balding, alcoholic Norman Bates, I think a film-going audience would question, why would you go and sit in this man's parlour? Why would you go up to this man's house? This man looks dodgy. Now, before anybody says anything about my hatred of Paul Heyman, I do not hate Paul Heyman. I'm a Paul Heyman guy. I think he's fantastic. It's just, unfortunately, he actually fits the physical build that the Psycho book actually describes. So it's with love, but that's the difference between the two Norman Bates. So the fact that they're taking a swing in this book at the screenplay having a young, thin, handsome actor is clearly Bloch making direct reference to the fact that Anthony Perkins should not have been Norman Bates, which, rightly or wrongly, I don't think it is something that should be discussed in a book like this. And for me, the Bates Motel being burnt to the ground, that is such a disappointing moment. And this is a running theme through this novel. It's one line and it's dismissed so quickly, and it raises so many questions. When did the Bates Motel burn down? Why did the Bates Motel burn down? Does Norman Bates know that the motel burnt down? Did it cause any problems with his sanity? Did it send him off the deep end? Did it help him? Was it able to improve his mental situation? We never know. You know, it's never mentioned. It's a throwaway line. The Bates Motel burnt down. One theory I have is that this is the first of many times that Robert Bloch is purposely writing things that are iconic from the first movie and then purposefully destroying them. So the first is the iconography of the house, the motel, it's burnt to the ground. It's gone, people. So disappointing. By the time the power comes back on in the prison, the other nun who is alive sees her sister leaving for their truck. In the storm, which I didn't mention, but it's absolutely hailing and snowing and raining and lightning and every other visually impairing element is going on outside, it is impossible for this nun to make out what the other nun looks like. She can see the habit, so she knows what she's seeing is a nun, and then when she gets to the van to find her sister, all she hears is a giggling nun who proceeds to attack her. Now, I'm sorry, but Norman's insanity and the profile of that insanity has totally changed already. His issues as the mother character in Psycho 1 came from crimes of love and crimes of passion. He became what he was because of his unwillingness to share his mother, which is what resulted in him killing his mother and her partner. And the guilt of this broke Norman's mind, split it in two, which is why Norman Bates and Mother were two distinctly different personalities. And Mother would manifest when the threat to Norman's reality was affected. So Norman Bates, in his own mind, could see that Mother was alive, she was well, he could talk to her, he could intercommunicate with her. If there was a problem, she would take over, she would do the business, and then Norman would awaken from a haze, unaware that anything had happened, and would then clean up after his dutiful mother. It was a very powerful, very smart, very well executed depiction of mental damage and trauma as a result of heinous events. Why is Norman a giggling nun? Like, why? You know, I can understand dressing as a nun to get out of the prison, but giggling and attacking other nuns, it just doesn't. I'm already a couple of chapters in, and it's just not gelling. So the police show up to the prison to investigate, and there is a odd reference by Dr. Claiborne, who is obviously now aware that Norman has escaped, to say that there is something coming for him in his dreams, as in Claiborne is having dreams. And he then says to the police that Norman Bates is a transvestite. Now, I want to tackle this with a degree of sensitivity to not offend anybody, and no intention is meant in the following section. This was a novel written in 1982 with very different sensibilities, but I think to label Norman Bates as a transvestite is so disrespectful. Time is taken in the first story to explain that Norman Bates is not a transvestite. Norman's psychosis was a split personality, that when he dressed up as mother, as I've just said, the mother personality was in control. This was not a man who dressed up as a woman. This was a personality that became feminine. To label Norman in this way is so dismissive of the complexity of that character as described in the novel and in the movie. It makes me feel like Robert Bloch has no interest in dealing with Norman Bates and just hitting him with that title. It just makes it so two-dimensional. I don't believe genuinely that Robert Bloch was trying to be transphobic in any way, but to just label Norman's illness as transvestites, that is a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, dismissing 20 years of his own work by saying, yeah, Norman's a transvestite. It really annoyed me, that did. And again, we're only at the beginning here, folks. You know, it's one of those, so having had that, slap in the face, we then join Norman in a van miles away from the prison, and he's on his way back to Fairvale, California, where he lives. So he lives just outside Fairvale in the original. He is in the back of this van with the dead nun, and, well, for YouTube, I'm going to say he is assaulting her corpse in the very worst way. What, when, and how did this become Norman Bates? There is no reason, no logic, no real justification other than some really poor comments of Norman wanting to be God over this corpse. It is totally out of character, and at this point, hashtag not my Norman was spinning through my mind, and I just feel like we're reading something completely different at this point in time. Norman Bates's psychosis was never this. His frustrations in the area of sexuality is what triggered Mother. There is no guilt to this action either. Norman is happy he is doing it. It is amusing to him. He derives pleasure from it. He thinks of himself as a god. This is not Norman Bates, and there is no follow-up, no explanation whatsoever. I think Robert Bloch is just doing his very best to make Norman Bates as abhorrent and nasty a little character as humanly possible, completely separating him away from the empathetic, kind, questionably morally, Anthony Perkins' portrayal. This is a character assassination, is what we're reading, and it really is frustrating. Having done that, Norman then goes and picks up a hitchhiker who plans to attack the nun and steal the van. In discussions with this giggling nun, he happens to mention the fact that Sam Loomis is alive and is still living in Fairvale and working at the hardware store. He remembers something about the Bates situation, and we leave Norman and the hitchhiker about to attack each other, both reaching the conclusion that they need to kill each other. Norman giggling in his nun outfit, the hitchhiker reaching into his pocket. The Hitchhiker of Exposition is what I named this character. Again, so much time is dedicated to explaining who this hitchhiker is, where he's gone, where he's going, what he's doing, what's his motives. Who cares? Like, who actually cares? All he does is tell Norman that Sam Loomis is still alive and still at the hardware store. But why? The conversation is so unnatural. It's just exposition central. They might as well have called the hitchhiker Basil Exposition for all the positive he provides. So much time is given to these nuns, to this hitchhiker, and yet we now have a completely heel-turned Norman Bates who is a necrophiliac, giggling drag murderer, and yet there's no explanation as to any of this. There's no time dedicated to it. There's no internal thought process given by Norman. There's no explanation whatsoever, but we know why the nuns joined the church and why the hitchhiker's on the road. It's just, again, it feels like Robert Bloch doesn't want to write Psycho. The police then are made aware of the fact that there has been a van found on the side of the road and it's on fire. Dr. Claiborne follows and they discover the truck burnt. The nun's body is in the back and there is another body in the front. Claiborne finds the hitchhiker's sign and summarizes that Norman picked up and killed a hitchhiker. At this point, the book feels like, ironically, with Halloween taking from Psycho, it now feels like Psycho is taking from Halloween. We now have Dr. Claiborne assuming the Dr. Loomis character from Halloween, the psychiatrist on the run looking for their killer, chasing the killer. It just feels like we're just kind of retreading old ground again. We're just going over cliches of horror now. The Doctor, the Van Helsing to the Dracula, the Dr. Loomis to the Michael. The only thing obviously spurring him on Dr. Claiborne that's slightly different than Dr. Loomis is that he has now come to have a realization that he needs to find Norman because his career is dead. Dr. Claiborne's career is dead. His book deal that he was working on is dead. Everything he's been working on is up in smoke, like the van that he's standing in front of. He has to find Norman to fix his career, otherwise nothing he's done, the experimental hypnotherapy, it's all garbage. We then join Norman wandering the streets, just Norman, no mother. It's just Norman in a nun's outfit, looking for revenge on the Loomises. Norman, for reasons not ever explained, is hero-worshipping Dr. Claiborne in his head, and then has the great idea, when looking for the Loomises, to go to a phone box and look in directory inquiries to find Loomis's address to see if it's listed or not. It's not. And then he realises, oh, there's the hardware store. I could go to the hardware store. So it's taken 22 years. Norman has seized his opportunity. He has killed a nun. He has dressed as a nun. He has killed a hitchhiker. He has taken a van to Fairvale. He knows Sam Loomis is still working at the hardware store. So his grand plan was to look in directory inquiries. I mean, this is why in horror movies, in my opinion, this is why we don't see Jason moving. This is why we see Michael Myers break out and then he's in Haddonfield next. We don't need to see the killers phoning director inquiries, looking in phone books, wandering around the streets. It's one of those really frustrating moments where it's kind of like, again, you're wasting my time. Why spend so much time having Norman Bates dressed as a nun, stumbling around in the dark, looking in director inquiries, looking in a phone book of all things? It conjures images of, it made me think of Terminator, where it's like, what if Norman got there and there was 26 Loomises in the phone book? Was he then going to go and knock on the 26 doors and kill the 26 people? What's the plan? There's no explanation given, and all it does for me, again, is just make Norman look like a chump. We then meet Lila Loomis, one of the heroes and survivors from the first story. She's at home, she sees on the news, it's explained on the television that Norman Bates has escaped and that a van has been found and is burning. This causes her to panic. Fearing possible revenge from Norman, after a failed attempt to contact Sam Loomis on the phone, she goes out looking for him, fearing that he might have a heart attack. When she gets to the hardware store, as is depicted in the first film and the first book, she finds Sam Loomis dead on the floor with a knife through his heart, and she is killed off stage at the end of chapter 10. So at this point of the novel, 10 chapters in, I'm getting really frustrated. Robert Bloch seems to be, as I've already mentioned, just killing people off and destroying anything recognisable from the first film. The Bates Motel is burnt down. Mother is gone. Norman is now a giggling nun. Sam Loomis is now dead, unceremoniously just murdered off stage, off screen, off page, however you want to refer to it, with a knife through his chest. The man who stopped Norman at the end of the first film is just dead. And his now wife, having got married between Psycho 1 and 2, Lila Loomis, has gone from being an engaging, proactive, self-righteous female empowerment character in Psycho 1 is now just a panicked housewife who sees something on the news and goes running to her husband, and then again is unceremoniously killed off page. They don't even bother to tell you. They just tell you the knife is coming down. It's so disrespectful to me that Bloch seemed to have it in his head that this was going to be acceptable for a movie. Now, one thing I'll point out very quickly here is I can understand the reason to kill Sam Loomis off page or off stage, because the actor who played him was dead. So a body double or something like that that makes sense. I can get that. Lila Loomis, the actress who played Lila Loomis, was alive and well and has a prominent role in Psycho 2, the movie, and she's a really good character in Psycho 2, the movie. She was a very well-respected, high-regarded actress. She is not going to come back to Psycho 2 to cry at a TV, run into a room and get slashed off stage. It just feels like Bloch just doesn't want to write Psycho. The subject of legacy characters has become very popular these days, like bringing a requel, it's now nicknamed, bringing back your legacy characters to continue the story whilst not having them centre stage is very much a norm now. Ghostbusters Afterlife, Scream, they're all doing it now. So again, Bloch is ahead of the time by returning to characters 22 years later. He just doesn't do anything with them. He doesn't give them any backstory, anything. And I wasn't expecting lots of time to be wasted, and I will give you an example of all I would have liked to have seen is Halloween 2018. Laurie Strode is reintroduced 40 years after the original Halloween. She sits there, and in less than 5 minutes, we feel the full weight of the impact of the night Michael came home, the full damage that happened after those events, the way that she was let down by the state, the way that she was disregarded, she's got no family, and Laurie Strode, as played by Jamie Lee Curtis, sits there with a wry smile and says, "I'm a twice divorced basket case." In 5 minutes in Halloween 2018, you get everything. There is less time paid in Psycho 2 than not in a chapter than on screen with Halloween. So I appreciate this is a little bit more of a ramble, but this really gets on my wick. This does, that you bring back legacy characters to kill them off. Why bother bringing them back in the first place? Why not just have Norman go to a random house and just kill people? He's not the Norman Bates from Psycho 1. He's a giggling nun. So chapter 12 through chapter 27, I'm going to speed up my review or my discussion about this now, because if I'm going to be frank, Norman Bates is lost in the background of this novel. And again, having destroyed the Bates Motel, killed Lila and Sam Loomis, had Norman escape but not the Norman that we know, the fact that he then vanishes for the rest of the novel makes me think that Bloch just slapped Psycho 2 on this, knowing it would sell well. But essentially, Dr. Claiborne heads to the Hollywood set of the movie Crazy Lady, which is in production, and gets himself appointed as a creative advisor. The movie director, for reasons that become clear later, looks just like Norman Bates. Now, maybe my logic to this is maybe in his head Robert Bloch thought, well, if the studio get Anthony Perkins back, we can't have Anthony Perkins in the film for 5 minutes running around in a nun outfit, so why not cast him in another role and we can talk about the fact they look very similar. It's done all the time in films. It would have made sense. With what Norman was doing, I don't think Anthony Perkins would have had any interest in returning. I also think that the direction this director goes in, I don't think Anthony Perkins would have returned regardless, as we'll get to in a bit. Everyone on the set of Crazy Lady seems to have a strange obsession with death and Norman Bates. I don't know whether or not, again, akin to later Halloween films, whether or not Robert Bloch was trying to explain that evil spreads, so that by telling Norman's story, the evil spreads and people become interested in death and Norman and darkness. And it's never bothered. They never bothered to explain it. Lots and lots of time and chapters at this point is then dedicated to just criticizing the movie making process, politics in casting, politics of directors, how writers don't get involved. This, for me, this next section of the novel is just Robert Bloch just being bitter for the sake of bitterness. There's no need for such venom to be in the novel. We get it. He didn't like Psycho 1. We get it. They didn't like Psycho 2. But to just make this thing, it just feels like, maybe arguably what some people would say about this video, the ravings of a lunatic. It really should have been rewritten, edited. A publisher should have kicked this back to Bloch and said, look, less of that, more of that. You know, we understand you're angry, no, but it just feels like this is just somebody spewing anger towards the Hollywood process. There are movies for that. There are situations where that makes complete sense. Not in a Psycho novel, is my opinion. So Dr. Claiborne then spends a ridiculous amount of time in the novel wandering around the set of Crazy Lady, systematically arguing with writers, directors, producers, stars, everyone he can, that the film's not good enough, the film is a splatter movie, we should be honouring Norman, we should be respecting Norman in this franchise. What is my answer to that? I'm reading this thing, sorry, I should say, and I'm thinking, I thought Dr. Claiborne was supposed to be looking for Norman Bates. So and again, you've got a van on the road to Fairvale. You've got presumably the murders of Loomis found out. The Loomises have been found out, so it should be public knowledge that in Fairvale there has been Norman has escaped and suddenly the Loomises have died. So there's a connection there. So Dr. Claiborne's logic is, I'm going to go to Hollywood. I'm going to go to the movie set of Crazy Lady, and I'm going to try, and if I can't shut this thing down, I'm going to make people make a better film about Norman. What? There's also a subplot that goes over 2 chapters where there is a mysterious fire on the set. It's not explained where it comes from. Some people seem to think maybe it's Norman. Dr. Claiborne starts to think it's Norman. And essentially the 2 chapters are Hollywood producers, basically persuading people to shut that news down. We're not talking about it. Contain it. We need to hide it because the film needs to go ahead. 2 chapters. You know, where is Norman? What's going on? Why are the Loomis' deaths not being publicised? Why is Dr. Claiborne not looking for it? Why has this film not been shut down? It raises so many questions. It's just bad writing. There's also, and I'll slow down a little bit for this because I think it needs a bit of thinking. There's another subplot over another chapter where the actress who is playing Mary in Crazy Lady, who looks suspiciously like Marion Crane from the first one, receives a kitten. A gift of a kitten is left for her at her doorstep. She brings in the kitten, and the payoff for this later is the kitten is murdered. It is stabbed with a kitchen knife. Okay, there are metaphors that are as heavy as a sledgehammer put into this, that essentially it must have been a gift from Norman. Norman, who sees this woman who looks like Marion Crane, has given her a kitten. A kitten is a cat. There is, which I won't say for YouTube standards, there is a word that is synonymous with cats and a part of a woman. You got it? You still with me? Okay. The cat has been stabbed. Therefore, Norman has stabbed this woman in the... What are you talking about? I feel like John Travolta in The GIF. It's like, where are we? Because this is not Psycho. This is not like... Why would Norman Bates think to do this? So, give me a break, is what I would say. Because of that... So not the mysterious fires, not the murders of the Loomis, not the outbreak of Norman Bates, not the death of the nun on the road, not the death of the other nun. The stabbing of the cat is what Claiborne thinks can now shut this film down. No, the film will proceed. Chapter 28. Chapter 28. So at this point, I'm going to just give a brief warning in advance that I am going to use a couple of words which, whilst not offensive, may come as a little bit of a surprise. I try to remain family friendly, even though this is a horror channel, predominantly a horror channel, and horror video. Chapter 28 of this book, hold on to your butts, is what I'm going to say. And remember, this is Psycho 2 I'm talking about. So, Chapter 28 of Psycho 2 has, in no particular order, I believe they're in a sauna, or I didn't write it down, a meeting of Robert Redford, John Travolta, Clint Eastwood, Sylvester Stallone, I was going to say somebody else then, Burt Reynolds, and newcomer Paul Morgan. Now, these 6 Hollywood actors who at the time, regardless of what you may say with hindsight, were very well regarded and very highly acclaimed at this point in time. These 6 gentlemen are proceeding to sit in a sauna, having not necessarily detailed, but quite open conversations about all the homosexual orgies that they have been attending recently. Now, when I got to that particular section, I actually just checked. I actually went in and made sure that the numbers actually matched this book, because I actually thought that the eBay seller, and even the CD, I thought there was some kind of joke going on here. The chapter is out of nowhere, and it's exactly what I just said. It's just them talking about these things. They talk about. So here you are, for example, because I'm still speechless when I think about this. So here is a real line. Sylvester Stallone elbowed his way to the mirror, pursing his mouth as he applied lipstick. Personally, I detest the action orgies. It's like opening a dozen beautifully wrapped Christmas packages and finding them all empty. But isn't that what we're doing here? Robert Redford said. We're peddling illusions, not just our bare necessities. Clint Eastwood rose. It's getting late. You'd better stuff our bare necessities into your jeans and get downstairs before Queenie throws a snit fit. Burt Reynolds tossed his powder puff into a tray on the dressing room table. Oh my God, I forgot. That party of Iranians is coming in again tonight. Not again, John Travolta made a face. I mean, Psycho 2 is what I'm just going to say. Psycho 2. Has Robert Bloch lost his mind in this novel? What has 6 Hollywood actors discussing drag and homoerotic and and homosexual orgies got to do with Psycho? And if you don't believe me, read and listen to it yourself, is what I would say. How did this book get to publication, is what I would say. Like, how did the agents of Sylvester Stallone, Robert Redford, these are living, working actors to this day. Why were they not, like, why was slander not raised or defamation of character not raised? How could Robert Bloch write that? A chapter of it as well. Insane is what I would say. Insane. So now we get to chapters 29 through 36, which I'm just going to nickname The Reveal. It is revealed at this point that the director has at some point in the past been to the Bates Motel. He is obsessed with Norman Bates and has decided that he wants to make his own snuff movie remake of Psycho. He intends to assault and murder the lead actress, who he cast because she looks just like Mary from the original movie and book. And in his mind, he is the only person in the world who understands Norman Bates. I mean, it comes out of nowhere, is what I would say. It comes out of nowhere. After everything I've just gone through with you, it just comes out of nowhere. It is impossible to be threatened or concerned by this director's sudden heel turn when the character keeps saying Mamma Mia every so often. Like every few lines he says Mamma Mia. It's really hard to be threatened by somebody who is talking about assaults and killing and understanding the minds of serial killers when he's saying Mamma Mia every so often. Why, as well, is everybody so determined to understand Norman Bates? Why does everybody seem to think that they're the key to understanding Norman Bates? He's a director who happens to look like Norman Bates, so suddenly he's the one who understands Norman Bates. We already understand Norman Bates. It's already been explained why we know Norman Bates. So again, this heel turn, if it had been played properly, if we hadn't wasted time wandering around movie sets and talking about Robert Redford and Sylvester Stallone, if time had been made to lay the foundations for this turn, it probably would have paid off a lot better. That actually you suddenly think, oh my God, is the director of Crazy Lady actually the killer of Psycho 2? So at this point in the novel as well, Claiborne is contacted by the police. They have somebody in custody who has confessed to the nun murder, and it's the hitchhiker. Yep, that's right. It turns out that the hitchhiker killed Norman Bates at the beginning of the novel, and dental records have confirmed this to be the case. Apparently, the hitchhiker, having killed what he assumed to be a nun in the van, couldn't live with himself, and the guilt of that turned him to go and turn himself in. He stayed at a friend's for a few nights and decided he needed to go and turn himself in. What? We return to the director in a horrible little scene, a horribly contrived little scene on the set of the Bates Motel, where he is assaulting and attempting to murder Mary, or the actress playing Mary, and he is then killed by Dr. Claiborne. We then jump in chapter 36, and Claiborne is in custody, having been shot off page by the police. So you are told about this in retrospect, and he is committed and sitting smiling like Norman Bates did at the end of Psycho 1. There are no answers given. There is no information given whatsoever. There are assumptions presented by other doctors that essentially, because of Norman's return to sanity, the book deal he was in preparation for, having Norman escape, finding out that his book would be useless because there was a movie coming, finding out that the book deal would now also be useless, and then finding out that Norman Bates was dead, means that Dr. Claiborne's mind split in two, and he became half Claiborne, half Norman Bates, with Dr. Claiborne attempting to chase after Norman Bates. But whenever Claiborne couldn't get where he needed to be, the Norman Bates side of the personality would take over, resulting in the burning of the set and posting kittens to people and all this kind of stuff. Give me a break, is what I would say. Like, the last chapter of this book, chapter 37, attempts to replicate the iconic ending of Psycho 1, with Dr. Claiborne having an internal monologue, and rather than having what we had in the original Psycho, which is Mother talking about how she's just going to sit there like one of Norman's stuffed birds, and she's going to pretend everything's okay, and they'll look at her and they'll see that she's innocent and she wouldn't hurt a fly, and there's a really sinister feeling to the end of that book and the end of that film and all that kind of stuff. This is an internal monologue about Claiborne is dead, gods and brothers and sisters, Norman is alive and will never die. garbage. So, thank you if you're still here, by the way. I appreciate that this may have come across a little bit more as a rambling than anything, but Psycho 2, the book, in this fan's humble opinion, is trash. It is, as a Psycho movie fan and as a fan of Bates Motel, and I live and breathe these films. I even like the Gus Van Sant remake of Psycho. That might put a few cats amongst the pigeons, but I find that this novel is just a disrespectful middle finger from Robert Bloch to Hollywood, to Hitchcock, to Anthony Perkins, and frankly to the fans. Like, if you read this and you like this, okay, I am happy for you. I am legitimately happy for you. But if you watch this and you really enjoy Psycho 2 and you think, oh, great, what a good time, and you are seeking a novelization that might patch up or expand on a number of points and make answers, gives questions to answers and answers to questions, do not go near this book. I am so frustrated by this book, as I'm hoping you've realised. The back of this book says, the long-awaited sequel to the classic thriller. For the last 20 years, Norman Bates has been in a state hospital for the criminally insane. With the help of a psychiatrist, Norman appears to have been cured of his mother's fixation, and now decides that he wants out. His opportunity arises when he visits he's visited by a nun. He kills her, uses her habit as a disguise. The psycho murders are about to begin again. That is the first 2 chapters of this book. It is just so contrived, so long-winded, so disrespectful, in my opinion. And this is coming from the author. So, strong not recommend. And I love books, and I hate when people crimp the spine and do so. I am that frustrated by it that I am willing to throw it across the room. It is trash. Psycho 2, on the other hand, the movie, is a really good movie. Please do watch it. I hope you enjoy that. And with that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This wasn't designed to be a big, deep dive. It's probably gone a lot longer than it should have. I want my channel to be very much about positivity and things like that, but sometimes, and Psycho 2, the novel, is an example, sometimes you just can't do that. And I think if you are a similar collector fan to me, you will be someone who seeks out these kind of things, who wants to find the elusive different versions, the Halloween producers cuts, the unedited Jason Goes to Hell, the alternative Psycho 2 that we didn't get, all this kind of stuff. Stay away from Psycho 2, the book, is what I would say. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe it. It's a little out of character from my other videos, I know. Other book reviews, I'm hoping, will be much more positive and much more well received in terms of I actually enjoyed reading it. This is the first time as a horror fan I have genuinely felt really angry when I got to the end of something like that, which is a rarity, but that's what I'm here for. They can't all be winners. There's going to be losers sometimes. And that book was a loser. So with that being said, until next time, stay scared.